What if the quietest person in the room is the most dangerous person to lose? Not because they seek revenge, not because they want to hurt you, but because the moment an empath finally stops caring, something irreversible happens. And most people never see it coming. You think an empath is weak because they forgive. You think they are fragile because they stay. You think their kindness means they have no limits. That is the illusion, the fatal illusion. Because what you call weakness was restraint. What you call softness was strength under control. What you call patience was a battle you never had to witness. And what you call unconditional love was a soul giving you chance after chance after chance. You never noticed how much they carried, how much they tolerated, how many sleepless nights they spent replaying conversations in their mind, searching for ways to fix what they did not break. How many times they swallowed their own pain just to protect someone else's comfort. How many times their nervous system absorbed tension that never belonged to them. How many wounds they silently translated into understanding. Because that is what empaths do. They look beyond behavior, beyond words, beyond masks. They see the hurt hidden inside people. And because they see it, they often excuse things they should never tolerate. While you were taking, they were giving. While you were distancing, they were reaching. While you were breaking trust, they were rebuilding bridges. Again, and again, and again. Until something inside them begins to change. Not suddenly, not dramatically, quietly, dangerously quietly. Because every empath eventually reaches a point where compassion can no longer survive. Self-betrayal. A moment where the heart stops negotiating with pain. A moment where the soul becomes exhausted from explaining what should have been obvious. A moment where self-respect becomes louder than attachment. And when that moment arrives, the empath you knew begins to disappear. Not with anger, not with revenge, not with a dramatic goodbye, but with silence. A silence so complete it feels unfamiliar. Because for the first time, they stop fighting for people who refuse to fight for them. This is where most people make their greatest mistake. They assume the empath will always come back, always understand, always forgive, always wait, but they fail to understand one terrifying truth. The deepest people do not leave quickly. They leave slowly, internally, piece by piece, long before their body walks away. They detach while still answering your messages. They grieve the relationship while still standing beside you. They mourn the connection while pretending everything is fine. And by the time you notice their absence, their soul has already gone. The tragedy is that many people only recognize an empath's value after they have destroyed the connection, after the messages stop, after the energy disappears, after the warmth vanishes from the room, after the person who carried everyone else's emotional weight finally decides to put themselves down. That is when the panic begins. That is when regret appears. Because they realize something too late. The empath was never dependent on them. They were dependent on the empath, dependent on the understanding, the patience, the emotional safety, the presence they thought would always remain. But once an empath learns the difference between love and self-sacrifice, everything changes. Because the most powerful transformation an empath experiences is not learning how to love. It is learning how to stop abandoning themselves for people who never deserved access to their heart. And when that lesson is finally learned, the version of them that tolerated everything dies. And in its place rises someone who finally chooses themselves. Someone who no longer mistakes suffering for loyalty. Someone who no longer confuses emotional exhaustion with love. Someone who understands that protecting their peace is not selfish. It is sacred. And when that awakening happens, everything changes. The most dangerous thing about an empath is not what they feel. It is how much they can endure. Most people think sensitivity makes a person fragile. They assume feeling deeply means breaking easily. But the truth is the opposite. The people who feel the most often survive the most. For years, your soul learns to carry things that were never yours. The disappointment of others, the anger of others, the fears of others, the wounds of others. You become a collector of emotional weight, a silent guardian of everyone's chaos. You walk into a room and immediately sense tension. You hear words, but you also hear what remains unsaid. You notice pain hidden behind smiles, loneliness hidden behind confidence, fear hidden behind control. And because you can see what others cannot, you spend your life trying to help, trying to understand, trying to heal, trying to love people beyond their brokenness. But there is a cost to living this way, a cost few people ever recognize. Because while everyone benefits from your compassion, very few notice the burden it places on your spirit. And because you can carry so much, people begin to believe you can carry anything. That is where the problem begins. The world starts rewarding your self-abandonment. People praise your understanding. They admire your patience. They celebrate your kindness. But very few stop to ask what all that giving is costing you. Very few wonder how many pieces of yourself you sacrificed just to keep the peace. Because every time you ignore your own pain to make someone else comfortable, a small part of you disappears. Every time you silence your intuition, a small part of you disconnects from yourself. Every time you tolerate disrespect in the name of love, your soul pays a price. At first, you do not notice it. The losses are too small, too subtle, too quiet. You tell yourself everything is fine. You tell yourself they are trying their best. You tell yourself things will change. You tell yourself one more chance will make the difference. But over time, those tiny sacrifices accumulate, like cracks forming beneath the surface of a dam, invisible, yet growing stronger with every passing day. And eventually, the pressure becomes impossible to contain. This is the moment most people misunderstand. They think the empath suddenly changed, suddenly became cold, suddenly stopped caring, suddenly walked away. But there was nothing sudden about it. The departure began months ago, maybe years ago. The empath was sending signals the entire time, signals hidden inside exhausted smiles, inside sleepless nights, inside conversations where they stopped asking for what they needed because experience taught them nobody was listening. Their body remained present, but their spirit was already retreating, slowly, quietly, protecting what little energy remained. Because there comes a point when the nervous system can no longer survive constant emotional survival mode. A point where exhaustion becomes wisdom. A point where exhaustion becomes wisdom. A point where the soul recognizes a truth it can no longer ignore. You cannot heal in the same place that keeps hurting you. You cannot keep pouring from a cup that has been empty for years. And you cannot save people who are comfortable watching you drown. That realization changes everything. Not because it fills the empath with anger, but because it removes the illusion that love alone can fix what accountability refuses to change. The illusion that understanding someone is the same as excusing them. The illusion that loyalty requires endless suffering. Suddenly, the empath sees clearly. They see every excuse they made, every boundary they ignored, every warning their intuition whispered in the dark. And for the first time, they stop arguing with what they know. That is the true breaking point. Not when they cry, not when they confront you, not when they threaten to leave. The real breaking point happens when they become emotionally honest with themselves. When they finally admit what their heart has known all along. Some people do not want healing. They want access. Access to your energy, your compassion, your forgiveness, your endless willingness to understand. But they do not want responsibility. And once an empath sees that pattern, it can never be unseen. The fog disappears. The spell breaks. The illusion dies. And from that moment forward, the person who once chased connection begins to choose peace. Not because they stopped loving, but because they finally started loving themselves. The greatest mistake people make with an empath is believing they will always be there, always available, always understanding, always willing to give one more chance. But what most people fail to understand is that an empath does not stop loving overnight. They stop loving in stages, in silence, in the hidden corners of their soul where nobody is paying attention. Long before they leave physically, they begin leaving emotionally, not because they want to, but because something inside them finally realizes a painful truth. You cannot keep setting yourself on fire to keep someone else warm. And once that truth enters the heart, it changes everything. At first, the empath still tries. They still answer the calls. still send the messages, still show up when nobody else does. But the energy is different now. The desperation is gone. The chasing is gone. The endless need to fix everything is gone. Because for the first time, they are watching instead of rescuing, observing instead of excusing, listening instead of explaining away red flags. And what they see is often heartbreaking. They see who only reaches out when they need something, who only values connection when it benefits them. Who mistakes kindness for weakness? Who mistakes patience for permission? Who mistakes loyalty for dependence? The empath begins seeing patterns that were always there. Patterns hidden beneath hope. Patterns hidden beneath love. Patterns hidden beneath the belief that people would eventually become who they promised to be. But reality is stubborn. Reality reveals what words try to hide. And eventually the empath stops falling in love with potential, stops believing promises unsupported by action, stops confusing who someone could be with who they repeatedly choose to become. This awakening is not dramatic. It is devastatingly quiet. One day they simply stop arguing, stop defending themselves, stop trying to convince others to care, stop trying to prove their worth. Because they finally understand something that changes their entire life. If someone constantly needs reminders to respect you, they already know. If someone repeatedly crosses your boundaries, they already know. If someone continues causing pain after seeing your wounds, they already know. The problem was never a lack of awareness. The problem was a lack of willingness. And that realization strikes the empath like lightning in the dark. Suddenly years of confusion begin making sense. Suddenly all the mixed signals become clear. Suddenly the emotional fog disappears. And once clarity arrives, the connection begins dying. Not because the empath becomes cruel, but because illusions can no longer survive truth. This is the stage where regret quietly begins growing in the people around them. At first, nobody notices. The empath still smiles, still speaks politely, still appears calm, but something essential has changed. The emotional doorway is closing. The access is disappearing. The endless reservoir of patience is finally running dry. And by the time others realize what is happening, it is usually too late. Because the empath is no longer fighting to be chosen. They have chosen themselves. No longer begging for honesty. No longer negotiating with disrespect. No longer sacrificing their peace to maintain a connection that only survives through self-abandonment. And that is when the regret arrives. Not because the empath became stronger, but because people suddenly understand what they lost. They lost the person who saw their pain without judgment. The person who offered understanding when others offered criticism. The person who kept believing in them long after everyone else stopped. The person who carried emotional weight they were never responsible for carrying. And now that presence is gone. Not taken, not stolen, lost, because it was taken for granted. The cruel irony is that many people only appreciate an empath after the empath no longer needs them, after the attachment is broken, after the emotional cords have been cut, after the soul has finally chosen freedom over familiarity. And that is the moment few people are prepared for. Because when an empath truly leaves, they rarely return as the same person. The heart that once accepted crumbs now recognizes its value. The soul that once tolerated neglect now demands alignment. And the person who once gave everything away finally understands that their energy was never meant to be available to everyone. It was meant to be protected, honored, and shared only where it is truly cherished. What happens after the empath breaks is not what most people imagine. They expect destruction, collapse, bitterness. They expect the empath to spend years trapped inside the pain, to remain haunted by what happened, to keep looking backward. But that is not what happens. Because eventually something remarkable begins to unfold. The wound stops bleeding. The silence stops hurting. The absence stops feeling like loss. And what once felt like an ending begins revealing itself as a beginning. This is the stage where the empath undergoes their greatest transformation. Not because life suddenly becomes easy, but because suffering finally teaches what comfort never could. For the first time, the empath stops asking, "Why did they do this to me?" and starts asking, "Why did I allow this for so long?" That question changes everything, because it shifts the focus away from blame and toward awakening. Suddenly the soul begins seeing patterns that have existed for years, patterns repeated across friendships, relationships, family connections, even strangers. Different faces, different stories, the same lesson, again and again. The lesson was never about other people. The lesson was about self-abandonment, about the moments you ignored your instincts, the moments you betrayed your own boundaries, the moments you chose acceptance over authenticity, because every empath carries a hidden wound, a wound that whispers, if I give enough, maybe I'll finally be valued. If I understand enough, maybe I'll finally be chosen. If I sacrifice enough, maybe I ge's love. But life eventually exposes the flaw in that belief. Love cannot be earned through suffering. Respect cannot be earned through self-erasure. And peace cannot exist where authenticity is absent. The moment this truth settles into the soul, a new version of the empath begins to emerge. A version that no longer apologizes for having needs. A version that no longer feels guilty for saying no. A version that understands boundaries are not walls. They are acts of self-respect. And suddenly, the people who once benefited from the empath's endless giving become confused. They say you've changed. You're different now. You're harder to reach, less available, less accommodating. And for once, they are right. You have changed. Because healing changes people. Awareness changes people. Self-respect changes people. The empath who once handed out unlimited access now becomes selective. Not out of arrogance, not out of pride, but out of wisdom. Because they finally understand something powerful. Every person who enters your life influences your energy. Every relationship shapes your inner world. Every connection either nourishes your spirit or slowly drains it. And after years of being drained, the empath chooses differently. They stop chasing, stop proving, stop convincing, stop begging to be seen, because they realize the right people never required persuasion. The right people never demanded self-sacrifice as proof of love. The right people never benefited from your suffering. And as this awareness deepens, something extraordinary happens. The empath becomes calm, not the fragile calm of avoidance, not the forced calm of suppression, but the unshakable calm that comes from knowing who they are. For the first time in their life, their peace no longer depends on someone else's behavior. Their worth no longer depends on someone else's approval. Their happiness no longer depends on someone else's choice. And that is true freedom. Because the strongest version of an empath is not the version that can endure endless pain. It is the version that no longer believes pain is necessary to deserve love. Now the energy that was once spent rescuing others is invested inward, into growth, into purpose, into healing, into becoming. The soul that once lived in survival begins living in alignment. The heart that once carried everyone else's burdens finally becomes light. And from the outside, it looks like the empath simply moved on. But what actually happened is far more profound. They didn't move on. They woke up. And once an empath truly awakens, they become something few people ever expected. Not broken, not bitter, not hardened, but powerful. Powerful because they finally understand their value. Powerful because they finally trust themselves. Powerful because they finally know that protecting their peace is not selfish. It is sacred. And once that realization takes root, there is no returning to who they used to be. And now, you stand in a place that once terrified you, a place you spent years trying to avoid. The place beyond attachment, beyond approval, beyond the exhausting need to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding you. For most of your life, you believed your purpose was to carry, to absorb, to heal, to save. You thought your value came from how much pain you could endure, how much forgiveness you could offer, how much of yourself you could sacrifice. You became the safe place for everyone else, the shoulder, the listener, the healer, the one who stayed when others left, the one who understood when others judged, the one who gave when others took. But somewhere along the way, you forgot something important. You forgot yourself. You became so focused on protecting everyone else's heart that you neglected your own. So focused on understanding others that you stopped understanding your own needs. so focused on maintaining connection that you abandoned your connection with yourself. And life noticed. Life always notices. That is why it brought you every disappointment, every betrayal, every heartbreak, every painful ending. Not as punishment, but as revelation. Because none of those experiences arrived to destroy you. They arrived to reveal you, to expose the places where you had become disconnected from your own truth, the places where you confused compassion with self-neglect, the places where you confused loyalty with self-abandonment, the places where you handed away pieces of your soul, hoping someone else would finally recognize your worth. But worth was never something another person could give you, because what is already valuable does not become valuable through recognition. The ocean remains powerful even when nobody stands on the shore to admire it. The stars still shine even when clouds hide them from view. And your soul remains worthy even when nobody appreciates it. That is the awakening. Not learning who you are, remembering who you have always been. The awakening is realizing that your sensitivity was never a weakness. It was perception. Your intuition was never overthinking. It was wisdom speaking quietly. Your emotions were never a burden. They were signals guiding you toward truth. And every painful chapter in your life was preparing you for this moment. This moment where you finally stop asking for permission to exist as you are. Where you stop shrinking to fit inside spaces that were too small for your spirit. Where you stop apologizing for your depth, your honesty, your sensitivity, your light. Because the truth is, the world does not need more people who betray themselves to keep others comfortable. The world needs people brave enough to remain authentic, brave enough to trust their inner voice, brave enough to walk away from what diminishes their spirit, brave enough to choose peace over familiarity. And that is exactly what you have become. Not someone who stopped loving, but someone who learned that love without self-respect becomes suffering. Not someone who closed their heart, but someone who finally learned where that heart belongs. Not someone who became cold, but someone who stopped setting themselves on fire to keep others warm. So if someone breaks an empath, they may think they have won. They may think they have taken something valuable. But what they fail to understand is this. When an empath finally stops abandoning themselves, they become unstoppable. Because a soul that has survived betrayal, disappointment, rejection, loneliness, and loss, and still chooses love, still chooses truth, still chooses authenticity, becomes something extraordinary, a force that cannot be manipulated, a spirit that cannot be controlled, a heart that no longer negotiates with its own worth. And that is what comes next. Not revenge, not bitterness, not regret, awakening, the kind that changes your life forever, the kind that reminds you who you were before the world taught you to doubt yourself. The kind that transforms your wounds into wisdom, your pain into purpose, your endings into beginnings. The kind that finally brings you home, to the one person you were always meant to save. The one person who stayed through every storm, the one person who never truly left, yourself.